The scent of burning bread jolted Clara Morrison awake at 3 in the morning, and she knew immediately that her entire future hung in the balance of what she could salvage from her makeshift oven. She scrambled from her narrow cot in the back room of the abandoned millinery shop, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a slap that echoed through the empty building. The year was 1876, and Dodge City, Kansas had no mercy for mistakes, especially not for a 22-year-old woman alone in the world with nothing but flour, yeast, and determination keeping her from complete destitution. Clara yanked open the cast-iron door of the salvaged oven she had bartered for with her last pair of decent shoes, and relief flooded through her chest. The bottom loaf was darker than she preferred, but not ruined. She could sell it for half price if necessary. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she pulled the 6 loaves from the heat, setting them on the scarred wooden counter that served as her workspace, cooling rack, and dining table all at once. The sky outside the cracked window was still black as pitch, but she had learned in the 3 months since arriving in Dodge City that the men who worked the cattle yards and the railroads wanted fresh bread before their shifts began at dawn. They wanted something that reminded them of home, of mothers and wives and lives that existed before the dust and the endless western sky. Clara wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of flour across her skin. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid and hung in damp tendrils around her face. She wore the same faded blue dress she had worn for the past week, the hem stained with mud and the cuffs frayed beyond repair. It did not matter what she looked like. What mattered was the bread, and whether she could sell enough loaves to buy more flour, more yeast, more fuel for the temperamental oven that threatened to ruin her every single morning. She had 10 loaves cooling now, which meant she had enough to sell 9 and keep 1 for herself, though keeping 1 felt like a dangerous luxury. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Each loaf cost her approximately 8 cents to make when she calculated the cost of ingredients and fuel. She sold them for 20 cents each, which gave her a profit of 12 cents per loaf. If she sold 9 loaves, that was $1.08 in profit. But if she kept 1 loaf for herself, she lost not only the 12 cents in profit, but also the 8 cents in cost, which meant 20 cents gone that could have been used to buy more supplies. Still, she had to eat something, and bread was cheaper than anything else available in Dodge City. The restaurants charged 30 cents for a meal, and even the cheapest boarding houses wanted 15 cents for breakfast. So she made her bread, sold what she could, and tried not to think about how tired she was, or how much her back ached from sleeping on the thin cot, or how desperately she missed her sister Mary. Mary had died 6 months ago in St. Louis, succumbing to the consumption that had hollowed her out from the inside until she was nothing but skin and bone and rattling breath. Clara had sold everything they owned to pay for the doctor and the medicine, but it had not been enough. Nothing had been enough. And when Mary finally slipped away on a cold February morning, Clara had been left with $17, a carpet bag full of worn clothing, and the knowledge that she could not stay in St. Louis where every street corner reminded her of her sister's laughter. So she had come west, following the railroad to Dodge City because someone on the train had mentioned that the town was growing, that there were opportunities for people willing to work hard. What they had not mentioned was that opportunities for women were scarce and usually involved saloons or worse. Clara had no intention of ending up in a saloon. She would bake bread instead, even if it meant working through the night and sleeping only a few hours each day. The sky was beginning to lighten now, shifting from black to deep blue. Clara wrapped each loaf carefully in clean cloths she had washed and rewashed until they were threadbare but still serviceable. She arranged the loaves in a large wicker basket she had found behind the general store, probably discarded because of the broken handle she had mended with wire and determination. The basket was not pretty, but it held the bread, and that was all that mattered. She stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, locking the door behind her with the key the landlord had grudgingly provided after she had paid him 2 months' rent in advance. The street was mostly empty, though she could hear sounds from the saloons a few blocks away, tinny piano music and raucous laughter that never seemed to completely die even in the darkest hours of the night. She walked quickly, keeping her eyes down and her arms wrapped around the basket. She had learned not to draw attention to herself, not to meet the eyes of the men who stumbled out of the saloons or loitered in doorways. Her usual spot was on the corner near the cattle yards, where she could catch the workers as they arrived for the early morning shift. She set down her basket and arranged the loaves so they were visible, their golden brown crusts still radiating gentle heat into the cool morning air. Then she waited, hands folded in front of her, trying to look respectable and competent and like someone whose bread was worth 20 cents. The first customers arrived as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of orange and pink. A railroad worker bought 2 loaves, counting out the coins carefully before tucking the bread under his arm and heading toward the yards. A shopkeeper bought 1 loaf, sniffing it appreciatively before nodding his approval. 2 cowboys from one of the nearby ranches bought 1 loaf each, joking with each other about whose turn it was to cook breakfast back at the bunkhouse. By the time the sun was fully up, Clara had sold 6 loaves. She had 60 cents in profit, plus the 48 cents she had spent on ingredients back, which meant she had $1.08 total. It was enough to buy more flour and yeast, enough to make another batch tomorrow. But she still had 4 loaves left, and the morning rush was over. Most people who wanted bread had already bought it or made other arrangements for breakfast. She stood on the corner for another hour, watching as Dodge City came fully to life around her. Wagons rumbled past, kicking up dust that coated everything in a fine brown layer. Women in far nicer dresses than Clara's walked by with shopping baskets heading to the general store or the butcher. Men in suits strode past with purpose, probably heading to the bank or the land office. No one looked at Clara or her remaining loaves of bread. She was beginning to think about packing up and trying again at lunchtime when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see a cowboy riding down the street on a rangy bay horse, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his clothing dusty from the trail but well-made, suggesting he was more than just a hired hand. As he drew closer, Clara could see that he was young, probably close to her own age, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble, and eyes that were a startling clear blue even from a distance. He reined in his horse directly in front of her, swinging down from the saddle with easy grace. Up close, she could see that he was even taller than she had thought, at least 6 feet, and that his blue eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, lifting her chin slightly. She had learned that showing weakness in Dodge City was a mistake. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl that marked him as someone from further south, maybe Texas or Oklahoma territory. "That bread for sale?" 20 cents a loaf, Clara said, pleased that her voice came out steady and businesslike. "Fresh baked this morning." He looked down at the 4 remaining loaves in her basket, then back at her face. "How many you got left?" 4 loaves, she said. "I will take them all," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a silver dollar. He held it out to her, the coin glinting in the morning sunlight. Clara stared at the dollar, her mind racing through calculations. 4 loaves at 20 cents each was 80 cents. He was giving her a full dollar, which meant 20 cents extra. She looked up at him, suspicious now. Men did not give women extra money without expecting something in return, and she had no intention of providing whatever he might be expecting. 4 loaves is 80 cents, she said, not taking the dollar. "I do not need charity." Something flickered in his blue eyes, something that might have been respect. "Not charity," he said, "just bad at arithmetic. Here." He dug in his pocket again and pulled out a handful of smaller coins, counting out exactly 80 cents and holding them out to her instead. She took the coins, dropping them into the small leather pouch she kept tied to her waist under her skirt. Then she carefully lifted all 4 loaves from the basket and held them out to him. He took them, but instead of turning to leave, he stood there looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You make these yourself?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, unsure where this conversation was going. "They are good," he said. "Best I have had since I left home." "You've not eaten any yet," Clara pointed out. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I can tell by looking. My mother used to bake bread every morning. I know what good bread looks like." He paused, then added, Name is James Holloway. I work at the Double R Ranch, about 10 miles north of town. Clara hesitated. She did not make a habit of sharing her name with strange men, but there was something about James Holloway that felt different. Maybe it was the way he had not argued when she refused his extra money, or the way he had mentioned his mother without any trace of shame or mockery, or maybe it was simply that he had bought all her remaining bread, which meant she could go home and rest for a few hours before starting the next batch. Clara Morrison, she said finally. Pleased to meet you, Miss Morrison, James said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was surprisingly courteous for a cowboy in dusty trail clothes. I will tell you what. Keep one of these loaves for yourself. You look like you could use a decent breakfast. Before Clara could protest, he had taken one of the 4 loaves and placed it carefully back in her basket. Then he touched his hat brim again, climbed back into his saddle, and rode away down the street, the remaining 3 loaves tucked into his saddlebag. Clara stood on the corner staring after him, her heart doing something strange and fluttery in her chest that she did not entirely trust. She looked down at the loaf in her basket, golden brown and perfect, still warm from the morning baking. Her first instinct was to chase after him and return it, to explain that she could not accept gifts from strange men. But he was already disappearing around a corner, and besides, her stomach was growling with a fierce hunger that made her knees weak. She picked up the loaf, feeling its weight in her hands. It was still warm, and when she tore off a piece and bit into it, the bread was soft and slightly sweet, with a crust that crunched satisfyingly between her teeth. She had forgotten how good her own bread tasted, how comforting it was to eat something made with her own hands. She ate the entire loaf standing there on the corner, tearing off pieces and chewing slowly, savoring each bite. It was the first time in weeks that she had eaten until she was actually full rather than just taking the edge off her hunger. When she finished, she brushed the crumbs from her dress, picked up her empty basket, and walked back to the millinery shop feeling lighter than she had in months. The rest of the day passed in a haze of exhaustion and contentment. Clara counted her money, purchased more flour and yeast from the general store, and returned to her small room to sleep for a few hours. When she woke in the late afternoon, she began the process of preparing the next batch of dough, kneading it until her arms ached and then setting it to rise near the warmth of the oven. As she worked, she found her thoughts returning to James Holloway. She replayed their brief conversation in her mind, trying to analyze why he had bought all her bread and then insisted she keep 1 loaf for herself. Was he simply kind, or did he want something from her? She had met enough men in her 22 years to know that kindness often came with expectations attached. But there had been something different about James Holloway. He had looked at her directly, yes, but not with the leering assessment she had grown accustomed to from the men in Dodge City. His gaze had been curious, perhaps even admiring, but respectful. And when she had refused his extra money, he had not argued or tried to insist. He had simply corrected himself and paid the exact amount she asked for. Clara shook her head, trying to clear away these thoughts. She could not afford to be distracted by a cowboy with blue eyes and a courteous manner. She had bread to bake and a living to earn, and neither of those things would be accomplished by daydreaming about a man she would probably never see again. But the next morning, when she set up her basket on the same corner at dawn, James Holloway rode up just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. He was cleaner today, his face freshly shaved, and his shirt looking like it had been washed recently. He dismounted and walked over to her basket, looking down at the 10 loaves arranged neatly inside. "Morning, Miss Morrison," he said, touching his hat brim. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," Clara said, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. "How many loaves you got today?" he asked. 10, Clara said. "I will take them all," James said, pulling out coins from his pocket, "and I would like you to keep 1 for yourself again, if that is acceptable." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had spent much of the previous evening trying to convince herself that she would not see James Holloway again, that his purchase of her bread had been a one-time occurrence, but here he was, offering to buy everything she had made and insisting she keep 1 loaf for herself. The sensible part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive and functioning through Mary's death and her own subsequent poverty, was screaming warnings. But another part of her, a part she had thought died with her sister, was responding to the warmth in his blue eyes and the gentle insistence in his voice. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you buying all my bread?" James looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him considering his words carefully before speaking. "Truth is, the food at the ranch bunkhouse is pretty terrible. The cook we have got now cannot make anything except beans and tough beef. The boys would appreciate some decent bread, and I figured I would rather give my money to you than to the bakery on Front Street." It was a reasonable explanation, and Clara wanted to believe it. But there was something in his eyes that suggested there was more to the story, something he was not saying. She decided not to push. If he wanted to buy all her bread every morning, that was his business. It meant guaranteed income for her, which was nothing to dismiss lightly. 9 loaves at 20 cents each is $1.80, Clara said. "If you want me to keep one for myself." James counted out the exact amount and placed the coins in her outstretched palm. His fingers brushed against hers for just a moment, and Clara felt a jolt of something electric run up her arm. She pulled her hand back quickly, dropping the coins into her pouch before he could see how his touch had affected her. She lifted 9 loaves from the basket and handed them to him. He had brought a canvas sack today, and he packed the loaves into it carefully, making sure not to crush any of them. Then he stood there, holding the sack and looking at her with an expression that made her stomach flip over. "You going to eat that one right here?" he asked, nodding at the remaining loaf in her basket. "Probably," Clara said. "Why?" "Just wondering if you ever sit down while you eat," James said. "There is a bench over by the hardware store. Might be more comfortable than standing on the corner." Clara glanced over at the bench he was indicating. It was only about 20 feet away, in clear view of the street. There would be nothing improper about sitting on a public bench to eat her breakfast, and her feet were aching from standing on the hard-packed dirt of the street corner. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said carefully. James smiled, and Clara felt her resolve weaken further. He had a good smile, warm and genuine, the kind that made crinkles appear at the corners of his eyes. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes? I've got a long ride back to the ranch, and my horse could use a rest." Clara knew she should say no. She should maintain a professional distance from this man who was technically her customer, but she found herself nodding instead, picking up her basket and walking over to the bench with James Holloway following beside her, leading his horse by the reins. They sat down on the bench, and Clara tore off a piece of bread, chewing it slowly while trying to think of something to say. James sat beside her close enough that she could smell the scent of soap and leather and something else that was uniquely him. He was not eating, just sitting quietly, apparently content to wait until she finished. "How long have you been in Dodge City?" James asked after a few moments. 3 months, Clara said. "I came from St. Louis." "That is a long way to travel alone," James said. There was a question implicit in his words, but he did not push. Clara took another bite of bread, considering how much to tell him. She had learned to be cautious about sharing personal information, but there was something about James that invited confidence. "My sister died," she said finally. "There was nothing left for me in St. Louis, so I decided to try my luck out here." "I am sorry about your sister," James said, and the sympathy in his voice sounded genuine. "That must have been hard." "It was," Clara said simply. She did not elaborate, and James seemed to understand that she did not want to discuss it further. "I came out here from Tennessee about 4 years ago," James offered. "My family has a farm back there, but I'm the youngest of 5 brothers. There was not enough land to divide between all of us, so I decided to head west and see what I could make of myself." "Do you like it here?" Clara asked. James considered the question. "Most days, yes. The work is hard but honest. The land is beautiful in its own way, even if it is nothing like the green hills back home. And there is a freedom out here that you do not get in more settled places. A man can make something of himself if he is willing to work for it." "Or a woman," Clara said, a hint of challenge in her voice. James met her eyes. "Or a woman," he agreed, "though I imagine it is harder for a woman alone." "It is," Clara said, "but I am managing." "You are doing more than managing, Maury. James said. "You are running your own business, making a living with your own skills. That takes courage." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She was not accustomed to praise, especially not from men who looked at her the way James was looking at her now, with something that might have been admiration mixed with a tenderness that made her chest feel tight. She finished the last of her bread and brushed the crumbs from her lap, suddenly feeling self-conscious about her worn dress and the flour that was probably still streaked across her face from the morning's baking. "I should get back," she said. "I have got a lot of work to do before tomorrow morning." "Of course," James said, standing up immediately. "I did not mean to keep you." He hesitated, then added, "Would it be acceptable if I came by again tomorrow? To buy more bread?" Clara stood up as well, clutching her empty basket. "If you want to buy bread, I will be here every morning at dawn." "Then I will see you tomorrow, Miss Morrison," James said. He touched his hat brim again, mounted his horse, and rode away down the street, the canvas sack of bread tied to his saddle. Clara walked back to the millinery shop, her mind whirling. James Holloway had bought all her bread again, which meant she had made $3.60 in profit over 2 days. It was more money than she had made in any previous week since arriving in Dodge City. If he kept buying her bread every morning, she would be able to save money, maybe even move to a better room or buy a new dress. But more than the money, she found herself thinking about the way James had looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he asked if he could sit with her while she ate. She found herself thinking about the way his fingers had brushed against hers when he gave her the coins and the way her heart had jumped in response. She told herself firmly that she was being foolish. James Holloway was a customer, nothing more. He was buying her bread because he said the food at his ranch was terrible, and his fellow cowboys wanted something better. It had nothing to do with her personally. She would do well to remember that and not let herself develop feelings that would only lead to disappointment. But the next morning, when James rode up to her corner just as the sun was rising, Clara felt her heart lift in a way that had nothing to do with guaranteed income and everything to do with the smile on his face when he saw her. This became their pattern over the following weeks. Clara would bake bread through the night, arrange her loaves in the basket at dawn, and set up on her usual corner. James would arrive within minutes, buy all her bread except for one loaf that he insisted she keep for herself, and then sit with her on the bench while she ate her breakfast. They would talk, sharing small details about their lives, carefully building a foundation of trust and understanding. Clara learned that James was 25 years old, that he had been working at the Double R Ranch for 3 years and had recently been promoted to foreman, which was why he had more money to spend on bread than the average cowboy. He told her about his family back in Tennessee, about his mother who had taught him to appreciate good bread, and his father who had taught him to value hard work and integrity. He told her about the ranch, about the endless sky and the cattle drives, and the satisfaction of working with horses. James learned that Clara was 22, that she had supported herself and her sister by taking in sewing in St. Louis, that she had learned to bake bread from her grandmother who had run a small bakery in Ohio before the family moved to Missouri. He learned that she was stubborn and proud, that she valued independence above almost everything else, that she had dreams of someday owning a real bakery with a proper oven and a shop front where people could come to buy her bread. They did not talk about feelings, did not acknowledge the growing attraction that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. But it was there in the way James always made sure to sit close enough that their shoulders almost touched, in the way Clara found herself smiling more often, in the way their conversations stretched longer each morning until James was arriving earlier and earlier so they would have more time together. On a Thursday morning in early June, about 6 weeks after their first meeting, James arrived at Clara's corner carrying something wrapped in brown paper in addition to his usual canvas sack for the bread. He dismounted and walked over to where she stood beside her basket, and Clara could see that he looked nervous in a way she had never seen before. "Morning, Miss Morrison," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," Clara replied, though by now they had progressed to first names when they were alone together. But there were other people on the street this morning, and she was conscious of maintaining propriety. "I have got something for you," James said, holding out the brown paper package. "It is not much, but I thought you might find it useful." Clara took the package, surprised by its weight. She looked up at James questioningly, but he just nodded at the package, encouraging her to open it. She carefully unwrapped the paper and found herself holding a pair of thick cotton oven mitts, clearly handmade but well constructed and practical. "I noticed you were using old rags to pull the bread out of the oven," James said. "I thought these might work better. My mother made them. I wrote to her a few weeks ago and asked if she could send some." Clara stared at the oven mitts, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. It was such a simple gift, practical rather than romantic, but it meant that James had been paying attention to her work, that he had noticed the inadequate rags she used and thought about how to make her life easier. It meant he had written to his mother about her, had told his family back in Tennessee about the woman in Dodge City who baked bread. "Thank you," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "This is very thoughtful." "It is nothing," James said, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes at her reaction. "Just seemed like you could use them." They conducted their usual transaction, James buying all the bread except one loaf, and then they walked over to their bench. But this morning felt different somehow, charged with an energy that Clara could not quite name. She ate her bread slowly, acutely aware of James sitting beside her, of the gift he had given her, and what it might mean. "Clara," James said, and the seriousness in his tone made her look up at him. "I need to tell you something." Her heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "I have not been entirely honest with you," James said, "about why I've been buying all your bread every morning." Clara felt her stomach drop. Here it was, the moment when he would reveal his true intentions, when whatever she had been building in her imagination would come crashing down. "Go on," she said carefully. "The first morning I bought your bread, it was because I genuinely thought it looked good and I wanted to bring some back to the ranch," James said. "But that is not why I came back the next day or any day since then." "Why did you come back?" Clara asked, though she thought she might already know the answer. James turned to face her fully, his blue eyes intense and sincere. "Because I wanted to see you again. Because from the moment I saw you standing on that corner with your basket of bread and your chin held high despite everything, I knew you were someone special. Because every morning when I ride into town, the best part of my day is sitting on this bench and talking with you." Clara could not breathe. She had hoped secretly and guiltily that James felt something for her, but hearing him say it out loud was overwhelming. "James," she started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I know I'm just a cowboy, and I do not have much to offer you. But I have got steady work and a decent income, and I'm good at what I do. The owner of the Double R has been talking about dividing up some of the ranch land and selling parcels to his most trusted workers. I've been saving my money, and I think I could afford to buy a piece of that land within the next year or two." He paused, then continued. "What I am trying to say is that I can offer you a future, maybe not a fancy one, but a stable one. A home, a life, maybe eventually that bakery you have been dreaming about, and more than that, I can offer you myself. My loyalty, my respect, my commitment to making you happy." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Are you proposing to me?" "Not yet," James said. "I know we have only known each other for 6 weeks, and I do not want to rush you into anything. But I am telling you my intentions so you know where I stand. I care about you, Clara Morrison. I think I am falling in love with you, and I would like permission to court you properly with the goal of marriage if you find that you can care for me in return." Clara looked at James, at his earnest face and his clear blue eyes and the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was prepared for rejection but hoping desperately for acceptance. She thought about the past 6 weeks, about the way he had treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, about the way he had listened to her stories and shared his own, about the way he had noticed she needed oven mitts and had gone to the trouble of getting his mother to make them. She thought about her life before James, the grinding exhaustion and loneliness of baking bread alone each night and selling it alone each morning. She thought about how he had changed that, how he had given her something to look forward to each day, how he had made her feel seen and valued in a way she had not felt since Mary died. And she thought about the flutter in her chest whenever she saw him riding down the street, about the way her day felt brighter after their morning conversations, about the fact that she had started taking extra care with her appearance on the nights before she knew she would see him, washing her face more carefully and braiding her hair more neatly. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission to court me." The smile that broke across James's face was like the sun coming up over the prairie, bright and warm and full of promise. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "You will not regret this," he said. "I promise you that." "I know," Clara said, and she realized that she meant it. She trusted James Holloway in a way she had not trusted anyone since her sister died. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Their courtship began properly after that morning, though in many ways it was simply a continuation of what they had already been building. James still came every morning to buy her bread and sit with her while she ate, but now he also came into town on Sunday afternoons, his one day off from the ranch, and they would walk together through the streets of Dodge City, talking and laughing and gradually letting down their guards with each other. James told her about his dreams for the future, about the ranch he wanted to build, and the horses he wanted to breed. Clara told him about her fears, about the nightmares she still had about Mary dying, about the terror she felt every time she thought she might not be able to make enough money to survive another month. James listened to all of it, never judging, never dismissing her concerns as foolish or insignificant. He introduced her to some of his friends from the ranch, other cowboys who teased him good-naturedly about being smitten, but who treated Clara with respect and courtesy. She introduced him to the few people she had come to know in Dodge City, the owner of the general store who sold her supplies, the landlord who had grudgingly come to respect her for always paying her rent on time, the woman who ran the boarding house next door and who had occasionally shared coffee with Clara on difficult mornings. As summer deepened and the Kansas heat became oppressive, Clara found herself working later into the night to avoid the worst of the oven's heat during the day. James noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the way she sometimes swayed with exhaustion on their bench, and he began arriving even earlier in the morning, bringing her coffee he had brewed himself at the ranch and carried into town in a battered tin canteen. "You are working too hard," he told her one particularly hot morning in July. "You are going to make yourself sick." "I cannot afford to work less," Clara said. "If I do not bake the bread, I do not make money." "What if you did not have to worry so much about money?" James asked. "What if you had help?" Clara looked at him suspiciously. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing improper," James said quickly. "Just that maybe we could move our plans forward a bit. I talked to the boss yesterday, and he has agreed to sell me 50 acres of ranch land on the eastern border. It is good land, with a creek running through it and enough grazing for a decent herd of cattle. I have got enough saved to buy the land and build a small house." He took a deep breath, then continued. "What I'm saying is that I'm ready to get married if you are. I know we have only been courting for about 2 months, but Clara, I know my own heart. I love you, and I want to build a life with you. Say yes, and you can stop working yourself to exhaustion every night. We will have a home together, and you can bake as much or as little as you want. Eventually, when we have saved enough, we can build that bakery you have been dreaming about." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Marriage, a home, security. Everything she had been working toward, everything she had been dreaming about being offered to her by a man she had come to love with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. Because she did love James. She had been trying not to admit it to herself, trying to maintain some emotional distance in case things did not work out. But the truth was that she had fallen in love with him weeks ago, probably that first morning when he had insisted she keep one loaf of bread for herself. She loved his kindness and his integrity, his quiet strength, and his ability to make her laugh even on her most difficult days. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and worth protecting. She loved the way he treated her as an equal, respecting her opinions and her dreams. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I will marry you." James let out a whoop of joy that startled several passing pedestrians and made Clara laugh despite the tears streaming down her face. He jumped up from the bench, pulled her to her feet, and spun her around, her worn skirts flaring out around her legs. When he set her down, he looked at her with such joy and tenderness that Clara felt her heart might burst. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. Clara was acutely aware that they were standing on a public street in broad daylight, that people were watching them with varying degrees of interest and disapproval. But she did not care. "Yes," she said. James cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her cheeks, and kissed her with a sweetness that made Clara's knees go weak. It was her first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more. When they finally broke apart, Clara was breathless and dizzy and completely happy. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of Dodge City. Clara wore a new dress that James had insisted on buying for her, a simple blue cotton that matched her eyes and made her feel more beautiful than she had in years. James wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. A handful of cowboys from the ranch attended, along with the few acquaintances Clara had made in town. The ceremony was brief, but when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Clara felt something shift inside her, a sense of belonging and security that she had not felt since before Mary died. She was no longer alone. She had a partner, someone who had chosen her and whom she had chosen in return. After the ceremony, James loaded Clara's few belongings into a wagon and drove her out to the land he had purchased. The house was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solidly built and clean, with real glass windows and a sturdy door that locked from the inside. James had even installed a proper oven, larger and more efficient than the salvaged cast iron monstrosity Clara had been using in the millinery shop. "I thought you might want to keep baking," James explained as Clara ran her hands over the smooth surface of the oven. "Not to sell necessarily, just for us and maybe to share with neighbors when we eventually have some. But that is up to you. You do not have to do anything except be happy." Clara turned to her new husband, this man who had somehow seen her at her lowest point and had decided she was worth loving, worth building a life with. "I am happy," she said, "happier than I have been in a very long time." That night, in the small bedroom of their new home, James made love to Clara with a tenderness and patience that made her fall even more deeply in love with him. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara's head resting on James's chest as he stroked her hair. "I'm going to make you so happy," James murmured into the darkness. "I promise you that, Clara. Every single day I am going to work to make you happy." "You already do," Clara said, "just by being who you are." They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks and months, building their life together one day at a time. James worked long hours on the ranch, managing the cattle and slowly building up their own small herd on their 50 acres. Clara kept the house, tended a vegetable garden, and baked bread several times a week. Not to sell, but simply because she enjoyed it and because James loved coming home to the smell of fresh bread. They made friends with their neighbors, other ranch families scattered across the prairie. Clara found herself part of a community in a way she had never been in Dodge City, invited to quilting circles and church socials, welcomed into homes for coffee and conversation. The other ranch wives taught her skills she had never learned: how to preserve vegetables for the winter, how to make soap and candles, how to treat common illnesses with herbs and home remedies. James taught her to ride a horse, patiently guiding her through the basics until she was confident enough to ride into town by herself when she needed supplies. He taught her about the land, pointing out the different grasses and wildflowers, showing her where the best fishing spots were along the creek, explaining the patterns of the weather and the migrations of the animals. By the time winter arrived, Clara and James had built a life that felt solid and real in a way that Clara's previous existence never had. They had friends and a home and a deep love for each other that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. On Christmas morning, Clara gave James a pair of leather gloves she had saved up to buy from the general store in Dodge City. James gave Clara a set of professional quality baking pans he had ordered from a catalog. "For when we build your bakery," he explained. And Clara had cried because he had not forgotten her dream, even though she had stopped talking about it since she was so content with their life as it was. In the spring, Clara realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to say anything, afraid to jinx it. But when she finally told James one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, his voice full of wonder. "Clara, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said. He knelt down and placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your papa cannot wait to meet you." Clara ran her fingers through James's hair, her heart so full of love and contentment that she thought she might burst. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much." "I love you too," James said, standing up and pulling her into his arms. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Clara continued her daily activities, though James fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less. By the time autumn arrived and her belly had swelled noticeably, James had started talking seriously about hiring someone to help with the housework so Clara would not overexert herself. Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1877, with the assistance of a midwife from a neighboring ranch. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara was certain she would not survive it. But James stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And finally, as the sun was setting, their baby entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the small house. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Clara's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Clara looked down at her son, at his tiny, perfect fingers and his eyes that were squeezed shut against the brightness of the world, and felt a love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." James leaned over, tears streaming down his face, and gently touched their son's head. "He is perfect," he said, Irmrit. "Clara, you did it. He is perfect." They named him Thomas after James's father and called him Tommy. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with James's blue eyes and Clara's dark hair. James was a devoted father, coming in from the fields multiple times a day to check on his wife and son, helping with the nighttime feedings even though Clara was nursing, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just staring at Tommy with an expression of absolute wonder. As Tommy grew from a baby into a toddler, Clara and James's love for each other deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, of course, like all married couples, but they had learned to communicate, to listen to each other's concerns, and work together to find solutions. Their intimacy, both physical and emotional, continued to grow, creating a bond that felt unbreakable. When Tommy was 2 years old, Clara became pregnant again. This time she was less anxious about the pregnancy, more confident in her body's ability to bring a child safely into the world. Their second son, whom they named William but called Billy, was born in the spring of 1880, an easier birth than Tommy had been. With 2 young sons and a growing ranch, James and Clara's life was busier than ever. James had expanded their herd and was now selling cattle at a decent profit each year. Clara had started selling her bread again, not out of necessity, but because several of the neighboring ranch families had tasted it and asked if she could bake for them regularly. She baked 3 times a week now, and James would deliver the loaves to their neighbors on his way to check on the cattle. The extra income from the bread sales was significant, and Clara and James started seriously saving toward building a proper bakery in Dodge City. They talked about it in the evenings after the boys were in bed, making plans and discussing logistics. James suggested they build the bakery on a lot he had been eyeing on the edge of town, close enough to catch traffic from people coming in from the ranches, but far enough from the rowdier parts of Dodge City to be respectable. By the time Tommy was 5 and Billy was 3, they had saved enough money to begin construction. James hired a carpenter from town, and together they built a small but well-constructed building with a shop front, a large baking area with 2 professional ovens, and a small apartment upstairs where Clara could rest between batches if needed. Clara Morrison Bakery opened its doors on a bright morning in May of 1882. Clara stood in front of her shop, wearing a new dress and a clean apron, her dark hair neatly pinned up, and felt a surge of pride and accomplishment that brought tears to her eyes. James stood beside her, holding Tommy's hand while Billy perched on his shoulders, and the expression on his face was one of pure pride and love. "You did it," James said. "You made your dream come true." "We did it," Clara corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you." The bakery was an immediate success. Clara's bread was already well known among the ranch families, and word spread quickly that she now had a proper shop in town. Within weeks, she was selling out of bread every day, and had started making other baked goods as well, cinnamon rolls and biscuits and occasional pies when fruit was available. James hired a young woman from town to help in the shop, so Clara would not have to manage everything alone. Her name was Emma, and she was 18 years old, eager to learn and grateful for the steady employment. With Emma's help, Clara was able to expand the bakery's offerings even further, adding cakes for special occasions and experimenting with different types of bread. The bakery became a gathering place for the women of Dodge City and the surrounding ranches, somewhere they could come to buy bread and stay to chat over coffee that Clara started offering for 5 cents a cup. Clara found herself at the center of a thriving community, privy to all the gossip and news, offering advice and support to the women who had become her friends. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. Clara would wake early to begin baking, spending the morning at the shop before returning home in the afternoon to be with her sons. James continued to manage their ranch, which had grown considerably over the years. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, with enough money to meet their needs and even occasionally indulge in small luxuries. In the evenings, after the boys were in bed, Clara and James would sit together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the prairie and talking about their days. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, James's arm around Clara's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, both of them content in the life they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked one evening, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Regret what?" Clara asked. "Marrying me. Giving up your independence. I know you valued that highly when I first met you." Clara lifted her head to look at her husband, at his face that was dearer to her than anything except their children. "I have never regretted it for a single moment," she said firmly. "You did not take away my independence, James. You gave me a partnership. Everything we have built, we built together. The bakery, this ranch, our family, it all exists because we chose each other, and we keep choosing each other every single day." James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Clara Holloway, more now than I did the day I married you, and I loved you quite a bit then." "I love you too," Clara said, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." When Tommy was 8 and Billy was 6, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. It was unexpected, and Clara was initially nervous about managing a new baby along with the bakery and her other responsibilities. But James was thrilled, and his joy was infectious. Their daughter, whom they named Mary after Clara's sister, was born in the winter of 1885, a healthy baby girl with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire house when she wanted to be fed. Tommy and Billy were fascinated by their baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help take care of her. Clara would often find Billy sitting next to Mary's cradle, singing to her in his slightly off-key voice, or Tommy carefully rocking the cradle when Mary fussed. Watching her sons with their sister filled Clara with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. James was just as smitten with his daughter as his sons had been. He would come in from the fields covered in dust and insist on washing up immediately so he could hold Mary without getting her dirty. He would walk the floors with her at night when she was colicky, singing lullabies he remembered from his own childhood. He declared that Mary was never allowed to get married because no man would ever be good enough for her, which made Clara laugh even as she assured him that they had many years before they needed to worry about such things. The bakery continued to thrive, and Clara trained Emma to handle more of the daily operations so she could spend more time at home with Mary during the infant's first year. Emma proved to be skilled and trustworthy, and Clara gradually came to think of her as more of a partner than an employee, eventually offering her a percentage of the bakery's profits in addition to her regular wages. As the years passed, Clara and James's life became richer and fuller. Tommy grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning, and who talked about becoming a lawyer someday. Billy was more adventurous, always exploring the ranch and bringing home injured animals for his mother to heal, talking about becoming a veterinarian. Mary was a whirlwind of energy from the moment she could walk, fearless and stubborn, and absolutely adored by her entire family. The ranch prospered under James's careful management. He had proven to have a gift for breeding horses, and his animals became known throughout Kansas for their quality and temperament. He expanded the ranch twice, buying additional parcels of land when neighboring homesteaders gave up and moved on. By 1890, the Holloway Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the area, and James had hired several cowboys to help manage the work. Clara's bakery had also grown, expanding into the space next door and now employing 3 women in addition to Emma. Clara Morrison Bakery was now known throughout western Kansas, and people would travel from neighboring towns to buy her bread and pastries. Clara had even begun shipping some of her baked goods to stores in other cities, carefully packaging them to survive the journey. Despite their success and growing wealth, Clara and James remained grounded and grateful for what they had. They had not forgotten the difficult early days, the uncertainty and struggle that had brought them together. They donated regularly to the church and helped neighboring families who fell on hard times. They treated their employees fairly and paid them well. They taught their children the value of hard work and the importance of kindness and integrity. On their 15th wedding anniversary, James surprised Clara by taking her on a trip back to Tennessee to meet his family. It was Clara's first time leaving Kansas since she had arrived in 1876, and she was nervous about meeting James's parents and brothers after all these years. But she need not have worried. James's family welcomed her with open arms, embracing her as one of their own, and showering affection on Tommy, Billy, and Mary. James's mother, a warm, energetic woman in her 60s, pulled Clara aside on the second day of their visit. "I want to thank you," she said, taking Clara's hands in her own. "For what?" Clara asked, confused. "For loving my son, for being the partner he needed. When James first went west, I worried about him constantly, but from the first letter where he mentioned you, I knew he would be all right. The way he wrote about you, the joy in his words, I knew he had found something special." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "He is the special one. He saved me when I did not even know I needed saving." "You saved each other," James's mother said wisely. "That is how the best marriages work." They spent 2 weeks in Tennessee, and Clara fell in love with the green hills and the slower pace of life. But she was also eager to return to Kansas, to their ranch and their bakery and the life they had built there. It was home in a way nowhere else could ever be. The train ride back to Kansas was long, and the children grew restless. But Clara found herself reflecting on how far she had come from the desperate, exhausted woman who had stood on a street corner in Dodge City selling bread to survive. She looked at James, who was attempting to entertain Billy with a game involving counting cows out the train window, and felt a rush of love so intense it took her breath away. As if sensing her gaze, James looked up and met her eyes. He smiled, that same warm smile that had first captured her heart 15 years ago, and reached across to take her hand. Clara squeezed his fingers, a silent communication of love and gratitude and contentment that needed no words. By the time Tommy was 16, Billy was 14, and Mary was 9, the Holloway family had become one of the most respected families in the region. Tommy had proven to be exceptionally bright, and had been accepted to study law at a university in the East. Billy had developed his father's love of horses and was already helping manage that aspect of the ranch. Mary had inherited her mother's entrepreneurial spirit and had started a small business making and selling hair ribbons to the other girls in town. Clara was 40 years old now, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but she felt more beautiful than she had in her youth, confident and secure in her place in the world. James was 43, his hair also graying at the temples, his face weathered from years of outdoor work. But to Clara, he was just as handsome as the young cowboy who had bought all her bread and insisted she keep one loaf for herself. They still had their morning ritual, even after all these years. James would come into the bakery just as Clara was pulling the first loaves from the oven, and they would sit together in the shop's small back room, drinking coffee and talking before the day began in earnest. It was their time, sacred and protected, a daily renewal of the bond that held them together. One morning in the spring of 1894, as they sat together in the bakery's back room, James reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "Do you remember the first time I bought your bread?" Clara smiled. "Of course I remember. You bought every loaf and told me to keep one for myself. I thought you were either very kind or had ulterior motives." "Both," James admitted with a grin. "I was kind, and I definitely had ulterior motives. I took one look at you standing there with your chin up and your eyes full of determination, and I knew I was looking at my future wife." "You did not," Clara protested, laughing. "I did," James insisted. "I went back to the ranch that day and told the boys that I had met the woman I was going to marry. They thought I was crazy." "You were a bit crazy," Clara said affectionately. "But I'm glad you were. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like if you had not stopped to buy my bread that morning." "You would have been fine," James said. "You are the strongest person I know, Clara. You would have found a way." "Maybe," Clara allowed, "but it would have been so much harder and so much lonelier." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me more than security and a home, James. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave that to each other," James said, echoing what his mother had told Clara years ago, "while we built it together." They sat there in comfortable silence, hands joined across the table, the scent of fresh bread filling the air around them. Outside, Dodge City was waking up. People starting their day, going about their business, but in the back room of Clara Morrison Bakery, time seemed to stand still, creating a perfect moment of peace and contentment. As the years continued to pass, Clara and James grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched Tommy graduate from law school and return to Kansas to open his own practice in Dodge City. They watched Billy take over more and more of the ranch management, eventually marrying a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch and starting his own family. They watched Mary grow into a beautiful, spirited young woman who decided to attend teachers' college, determined to make her own mark on the world. The bakery continued to thrive under Emma's management, with Clara gradually stepping back from the daily operations but still coming in several times a week to bake and to maintain the connection she had built with the community over the years. The ranch remained successful, with Billy proving to be just as skilled a manager as his father had been. By the time Clara was 50 and James was 53, they were grandparents 3 times over, with Billy and his wife providing them with 2 grandsons and a granddaughter. Clara loved being a grandmother, spoiling her grandchildren with sweets from the bakery and telling them stories about their father and uncles when they were young. James had slowed down somewhat, his body bearing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but he was still strong and vital, still riding out to check on the cattle, still working alongside his son and the ranch hands. He and Clara still had their morning coffee together, still sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset, still shared a bed and a life filled with love and companionship. On a warm evening in June of 1906, Clara and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their 60s now, their children grown and their grandchildren thriving. The ranch and the bakery were both successful and would continue to be so under the next generation's management. They had built something lasting, something that would endure beyond their own lives. "We did all right, didn't we?" James said, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "We did better than all right," Clara said, leaning into his warmth. "We built a good life. We raised good children. We loved each other well." "We are still loving each other well," James corrected. "This is not past tense, Clara. I love you just as much today as I ever did." "I know," Clara said, "and I love you just as much. More even because I know you now in ways I could not have known you when we were young. I know all your strengths and all your weaknesses, and I love all of it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Finally, James spoke again. "If you could go back and change anything, would you?" Clara thought about the question seriously, as James deserved. She thought about the hard times, the struggles and the fears and the moments of doubt. She thought about the nights she had cried herself to sleep worrying about money or the children or the future. She thought about the arguments and disagreements, the times when she and James had frustrated each other or failed to understand each other. But then she thought about everything else. The laughter and the joy and the deep contentment of building a life with someone she loved, the pride of watching her children grow into good, capable adults, the satisfaction of running a successful business, the comfort of lying beside the same man every night for over 30 years, secure in his love and commitment. "No," she said finally, "I would not change a single thing, because everything, good and bad, brought us to right here, right now, and right here, right now is exactly where I want to be." James pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Me too," he said. "Me too." As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a desperate young woman selling bread on a street corner, alone and afraid and uncertain of her future. She had been saved by a cowboy with kind eyes who had bought all her bread and told her to keep one loaf for herself, a simple gesture that had changed the entire course of her life. But it had not been just about being saved. It had been about choosing each other day after day, year after year. It had been about building something together, combining their individual strengths to create something greater than either of them could have achieved alone. It had been about love, yes, but also about partnership and respect and commitment and all the small daily choices that added up to a life well lived. Clara thought about that first loaf of bread, the one James had insisted she keep for herself. At the time, she had thought it was just about feeding her body, about having enough to eat. But now she understood that it had been about so much more. It had been James's way of telling her that she mattered, that she deserved to be cared for, that she did not have to face the world alone anymore. And in the years since, James had given her so many more gifts. Not material things, though those had come too, but gifts of time and attention and unwavering support. He had believed in her dreams and had worked alongside her to make them real. He had celebrated her successes and comforted her during her failures. He had loved her in her strength and in her weakness, in her youth, and now in her older age. She had given him gifts in return, her love and her loyalty, her partnership in building the ranch and raising their children, her body and her heart, and her unwavering commitment to their marriage. She had believed in him when he doubted himself, had stood beside him through droughts and economic downturns and all the challenges that came with ranching in Kansas. She had made him a home and had given him children and had loved him with everything she had. And together they had created something beautiful, a family that loved and supported each other, businesses that served their community and provided employment to others, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. A love story that had started with bread and had grown into something rich and nourishing and sustaining, something that had fed not just their bodies but their souls. As Clara and James sat together on the porch, surrounded by the life they had built, Clara felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. She had been given so much more than she had ever dared to hope for during those desperate early days in Dodge City. She had been given love and family and purpose and belonging. She had been given a partner who saw her as an equal and who had worked alongside her to create the life they both wanted. The years continued to roll by peacefully. Tommy's law practice flourished, and he eventually was elected as a county judge, making his parents enormously proud. Billy expanded the ranch further, buying more land and increasing the horse breeding operation until Holloway horses were known throughout the western states. Mary completed her education and became a teacher in Dodge City, beloved by her students and respected by the community. The grandchildren grew, and Clara and James delighted in watching them develop their own personalities and interests. There were eventually 8 grandchildren in total, as Tommy married and had 3 children of his own, and Mary eventually married a fellow teacher and had 2 children. Each grandchild was precious to Clara and James, each one a living testament to the love story that had started with a basket of bread on a dusty street corner. Clara continued to bake, though now it was mostly for family gatherings and special occasions rather than for the bakery. Her hands were not as steady as they once had been, and arthritis sometimes made kneading dough difficult. But she still loved the alchemy of bread making, the way simple ingredients could be transformed into something nourishing and delicious. And every time she baked, she thought about that young woman she had been standing on a corner in the pre-dawn darkness, hoping desperately that someone would buy her bread. James remained active on the ranch as long as his body would allow, finally retiring fully when he turned 70 and turning complete control over to Billy. He missed the daily work, but he enjoyed having more time to spend with Clara, to take walks together along the creek that ran through their property, to sit on the porch and watch their grandchildren play, to simply be together without the demands of work constantly pulling at their attention. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1916, their children threw them a grand celebration at the ranch. It seemed like everyone they had ever known was there, friends and neighbors and business associates, people whose lives had been touched by Clara and James over the decades. There were speeches and toasts and a huge meal prepared by caterers brought in from Dodge City. Tommy, as the eldest, gave a speech about his parents that brought tears to Clara's eyes. "My parents taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day," Tommy said, looking at Clara and James with affection. "They showed us that a good marriage is built on mutual respect, on supporting each other's dreams, on being willing to work hard together to build the life you want. They gave us an example of what love should look like, and for that, I will be forever grateful." Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and the children had taken the grandchildren home to bed, Clara and James stood together in the yard of their ranch, looking up at the stars that filled the vast Kansas sky. James had his arms around Clara, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. 40 years, James said, his voice full of wonder. "Where did the time go?" "Into our life," Clara said, "into our children and our work and all the moments, big and small, that made up our days. The time went exactly where it should have gone." "Would you do it all again?" James asked. "If you could go back to that morning on the street corner, knowing everything that was going to happen, would you still say yes when I asked to court you?" Clara turned in his arms so she could look up at his face, at the lines and wrinkles that mapped out their years together, at the blue eyes that still looked at her with love and desire and deep affection. "In a heartbeat," she said, "I would say yes 1,000 times over. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, James Holloway. You and the life we built together." James kissed her then, a sweet, gentle kiss that still had the power to make her heart flutter even after 40 years of marriage. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," he said. "That morning when I saw you on that corner, I had no idea that I was looking at my entire future. But I'm so grateful that I stopped to buy your bread. It was the best decision I ever made." They stood there under the stars, holding each other. Two people who had started as strangers and had become partners, lovers, best friends, co-parents, and each other's greatest supporters. They had built a life together out of flower and determination and love, and it had been a good life, a life full of meaning and purpose and deep connection. As they grew older still, their bond only strengthened. They faced the challenges of aging together, supporting each other through health scares and the inevitable slowing down that came with advancing years. When James developed heart problems in his early 70s, Clara was by his side constantly, managing his medication and making sure he followed doctor's orders. When Clara fell and broke her hip at 72, James was there every day during her recovery, encouraging her through the painful rehabilitation process. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1926, surrounded once again by children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. Clara was 72 years old and James was 75. They had both slowed considerably, their bodies bearing the marks of age and hard work, but their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other remained as strong as ever. The celebration was smaller and more intimate than their 40th anniversary had been. Many of the people who had attended that earlier celebration were gone now, claimed by age or illness, but their children and grandchildren surrounded them with love, and Clara felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the family she and James had created. That night, lying in bed beside her husband of 50 years, Clara thought about everything they had been through together. The struggles and the triumphs, the sorrows and the joys, the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. She thought about how improbable their love story had been, how a chance encounter on a street corner in Dodge City had led to this, to 50 years of marriage, and a family that spanned 3 generations and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" James asked, his voice sleepy. "For everything, for buying my bread that morning, for seeing something in me worth loving, for building this life with me, for 50 years of being the best partner anyone could ask for." James rolled over to face her, his hand finding hers under the covers. "It was my privilege," he said. "Every single day with you has been a gift, Clara, even the hard days. Especially the hard days, because those are the ones where we proved how strong we are together." They fell asleep holding hands, as they had done thousands of times over the past 50 years, and in the morning they woke up together, ready to face another day as partners, as lovers, as 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and had chosen to build a life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one loaf of bread at a time. The years passed more slowly now, each day precious and measured. Clara and James spent their time quietly, surrounded by the love of their family. They told stories to their great-grandchildren about the old days, about Dodge City in the 1870s, and the challenges of building a life on the frontier. They passed on their wisdom and their values, teaching the younger generations about hard work and integrity and the importance of choosing your partner wisely and loving them well. Clara's bakery had been passed down to one of Billy's daughters, who ran it with the same dedication and skill that Clara had brought to it. The bakery was still successful, still a gathering place for the community, still known for producing the best bread in western Kansas. Clara would sometimes go into the shop and watch her granddaughter work, seeing echoes of her own younger self in the efficient movements and the care taken with each loaf. The ranch remained in the family as well, managed now by Billy's eldest son, but still bearing the Holloway name. The horses bred on the ranch were still sought after throughout the region, and the cattle operation remained profitable. James took great pride in knowing that the 50 acres he had purchased as a young cowboy had grown into an operation that supported multiple families and would continue to do so for generations. When Clara was 78 and James was 81, they faced the reality that their time together was growing shorter. James's heart condition had worsened, and the doctor had told them gently that there was little more that could be done. James accepted this news with the same quiet courage he had brought to every challenge in his life, but Clara struggled with the thought of losing him, of facing a future without her partner of more than 50 years. "I am not afraid, Heath," James told her one evening as they sat together on the porch of their home, the same porch where they had sat countless times before. "I have lived a good life, Clara, a life full of love and purpose and meaning. I have no regrets." "I am afraid," Clara admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I do not know how to be in this world without you." James took her hand, his grip still strong despite his weakened condition. "You will manage because you are strong and capable and surrounded by people who love you. And I will not really be gone, Clara. I will be in every sunrise you watch from this porch, in every loaf of bread baked in your granddaughter's shop, In every horse that runs across this land, in every laugh of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I will be woven into the very fabric of the life we built together." Clara leaned against him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat, the warmth of his presence. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since that first morning, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I know," James said, "and I love you the same way. Always have, always will." James passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, with Clara lying beside him holding his hand. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Kansas, a testament to the impact he had made on the world around him. Their children spoke about their father with love and respect, sharing stories that made people laugh and cry. Clara sat in the front row surrounded by her family, feeling the enormous hole that James's death had left in her life, but also feeling grateful for every single day they had spent together. In the months following James's death, Clara struggled. She had been half of a partnership for so long that she was not sure how to be just herself. Everything reminded her of James. The empty space beside her in bed, the coffee she made for two out of habit, the sunset that seemed less beautiful without him there to share it. There were days when the grief felt like it might swallow her whole. But gradually, with the support of her children and grandchildren, Clara found a way forward. She realized that the best way to honor James's memory was to continue living fully, to find joy in the family they had created together, to appreciate the legacy they had built. She started spending more time at the bakery, teaching her great-grandchildren how to bake bread, passing on the skills that had started everything. She worked on writing down the stories of her life and her marriage, wanting to preserve those memories for future generations. Clara lived for 5 more years after James's death, years filled with family and purpose, and the satisfaction of knowing that she and James had built something that would endure. She remained sharp and engaged until nearly the end, her mind full of memories and her heart full of love for the people around her. When Clara passed away peacefully at the age of 83, surrounded by her children, she went with a smile on her face, her last words being, "James, I am coming home." She was buried beside her husband on the ranch they had built together under a spreading cottonwood tree that overlooked the creek where they had walked so many times over the years. At her funeral, Tommy, now a retired judge with grandchildren of his own, stood to speak about his mother. His voice was thick with emotion as he addressed the gathered crowd. "My mother used to tell us the story of how she and my father met," Tommy said. "She was a young woman alone in Dodge City, struggling to survive by baking bread to sell at dawn. My father was a cowboy who bought every loaf and told her to keep one for them. It seems like such a simple story, but it was actually the beginning of something extraordinary." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, at the lives that had been touched by Clara and James Holloway. "What my parents taught us was that love is not just about the big romantic gestures, though there were plenty of those over their 56 years together. Love is about showing up every day, about supporting each other's dreams, about building a life together one small choice at a time. Love is about buying all the bread and making sure your partner keeps one for themselves, even when resources are scarce. Love is about seeing someone at their lowest point and choosing to lift them up, not out of pity, but out of recognition of their inherent worth and strength." He smiled through his tears. "My parents built a life out of flour and determination and love. They created a family and businesses and a legacy that will continue for generations. But more than that, they showed us all what it means to truly love someone, to be a true partner, to build something meaningful together. And for that, we will be forever grateful." As the mourners dispersed after the funeral, the Holloway family gathered at the ranch house. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even a few great-great-grandchildren filled the rooms where Clara and James had lived and loved for so many years. They shared stories and memories, laughing and crying as they remembered the two people who had started it all. In the bakery in Dodge City, Clara's great-granddaughter continued the tradition, baking bread each night to sell at dawn. The recipes were the same ones Clara had used over a century ago, refined and perfected over decades. And every morning when the first loaves came out of the oven, she would think about her great-grandmother, about the courage it must have taken to stand on a street corner selling bread, about the love story that had started with a simple transaction and had grown into something that shaped the lives of so many. The Holloway Ranch continued to thrive, managed now by the fourth generation, but still operating according to the principles that James had established more than a century before. Hard work, integrity, and a commitment to treating people and animals with respect and dignity. The horses bred on the ranch were still known throughout the region, carrying on a tradition that had started when a young cowboy had decided to buy some land and build a future for himself and the woman he loved. And sometimes on quiet evenings, members of the Holloway family would sit on the porch of the old ranch house and look out at the sunset, remembering the two people who had started it all. They would think about Clara, standing on a street corner in Dodge City, tired and hungry and alone, baking bread to survive. They would think about James, a young cowboy with kind eyes who had bought all her bread and insisted she keep one loaf for herself. They would think about how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that spanned more than half a century, a love that had created a family and built businesses and left a legacy that would endure for generations. They would think about how love, real love, was not just about passion and romance, though those things were important. Real love was about partnership and respect and showing up for each other every single day, in big ways and small. And they would understand in a way that could not be put into words that Clara and James Holloway had gotten it right. They had found each other against all odds, had chosen each other when it would have been easier not to, and had built a life together that was rich and meaningful and full of love. They had shown everyone who knew them what marriage should look like, what partnership should feel like, what it meant to truly love someone with your whole heart for your entire life. The story of Clara and James Holloway became a family legend passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that the greatest love stories often start in the most unexpected ways. It started with bread baked in the darkness, with a woman's determination to survive, with a man's kindness, and the recognition that he had found something precious. It grew into a partnership that weathered storms and celebrated triumphs, that created life and built businesses and left the world better than they had found it. It deepened into a love that sustained them through 56 years of marriage, through the joys and sorrows that make up a human life, through youth and middle age, and into their final years. And it ended, as all love stories must, with death parting them. But even death could not truly separate Clara and James Holloway. They lived on in their descendants, in the businesses they had built, in the values they had passed down, in the memories of everyone whose lives they had touched. They lived on in every loaf of bread baked in that Dodge City bakery, in every horse bred on that Kansas ranch, in every sunset viewed from that porch where they had sat together so many times. Their love story proved that the most extraordinary things can come from the simplest beginnings, that a chance encounter can change the entire course of a life, that love, real and true and deep, can transform not just two people but everyone around them, that the choice to care for someone, to support them, to build a life together can create ripples that extend far beyond your own existence. Clara Morrison had been a young woman alone in the world, baking bread to sell at dawn, when a cowboy bought every loaf and told her to keep one for them. That moment, that simple transaction infused with unexpected kindness, had been the beginning of everything. It had been the first thread in a tapestry that would eventually include children and grandchildren, businesses and homes, friendships and community, a whole rich life built on the foundation of love and partnership. And in the end, that was the real legacy of Clara and James Holloway. Not the businesses or the property or the material wealth, though those things were significant. The real legacy was the love they had shared and the example they had set, showing generation after generation what it meant to choose someone, to commit to them fully, to build a life together through joy and sorrow, through easy times and hard times, through youth and age. Their story was a testament to the transformative power of love, to the extraordinary things that can grow from simple acts of kindness, to the beauty of two people choosing each other and then choosing each other again every single day until death finally parted them. And even then, their love continued on, woven into the fabric of the family and the businesses and the community they had helped to build, a living legacy that would endure long after they were gone. This was the story of Clara and James Holloway, a story that started with bread baked in the darkness and a cowboy's kind eyes, and that grew into something beautiful and lasting and true. It was a love story for the ages, proof that the most extraordinary lives are often built on the simplest foundations, and that love, when given freely and nurtured carefully, can create miracles.